Here is something most people accept without question. Public libraries are a product of the modern age. The story goes that as literacy spread through the 19th century, communities built reading rooms, then lending libraries, then grand civic institutions to serve a newly educated public. Demand came first. Infrastructure followed. That is how civilization works. Except the timeline doesn't hold. Not by a small margin. Not in one or two unusual cases. Across dozens of towns with populations under 2,000, towns where formal schooling had not yet reached the majority of residents, there exist library buildings of a scale and structural complexity that would have required years of planning, significant capital, and a workforce skilled in stone cutting, ironwork, and decorative masonry. Buildings that, by the most straightforward reading of the historical record, were completed before the communities they supposedly served had any measurable literacy rate to speak of. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions, but the questions themselves are worth sitting with. Start with the numbers. In the United States alone, between 1881 and 1917, Andrew Carnegie funded the construction of 1,679 library buildings. This figure is well documented and widely celebrated. What receives less attention is the subset of those buildings, and they are not rare exceptions, located in towns whose 1900 census data recorded fewer than 800 residents, with adult literacy rates that local school board records placed at or below 40%. A library, in the functional sense, serves readers. Readers require literacy. Literacy requires schools. Schools require teachers, funding, time, and generational investment. The sequence has an internal logic. It takes decades to move through those stages in a small rural community. Yet in towns like Colfax, Washington, population 2,700 at the time of the library's construction in 1905, the building that appeared was not a modest reading room. It was a two-story structure with load-bearing stone columns, a formal entrance arch, vaulted interior ceilings, and decorative terracotta detail work along the exterior cornice. The Colfax Carnegie Library was built to a standard of permanence and civic grandeur that most American cities of 50,000 people did not yet possess in comparable public buildings. Colfax was a wheat farming community. Its main industry was agricultural. Its downtown, photographed in 1903, shows dirt streets, wooden storefronts, and a population clearly in the early stages of settled infrastructure. 2 years later, columns, arches, stone. The discomfort is not about one building. That could be explained as civic ambition, local pride, a generous donor with strong opinions about aesthetics. The discomfort is about consistency. Travel across the American Midwest in the first decade of the 20th century and you find the same pattern repeating in town after town. Osage, Iowa. Moberly, Missouri. Lamar, Colorado. Fairfield, Nebraska. Each with populations under 3,000. Each with a Carnegie Library constructed to specifications. Ceiling height, column placement, window proportion, floor plan layout, that align with a standardized architectural vocabulary far more elaborate than local need would seem to require. Architects were hired from regional firms. Blueprints were approved. Bids were taken. Local contractors were sometimes involved, but the structural elements, the stone, the decorative ironwork, the tile, frequently came from suppliers in larger cities. The logistics of delivering and assembling these materials in small rural towns in 1903 or 1907 were not trivial. Railroads helped. But the organizational infrastructure required to plan, fund, deliver, and complete these buildings in communities that had no prior tradition of large civic construction is itself a question the record doesn't fully answer. Where did the administrative capacity come from? Consider what building a Carnegie Library in a small town actually required. A town had to formally apply. It had to demonstrate community need, a concept that, in Carnegie's framework, meant it had to prove existing interest in reading and learning. It had to commit to providing an ongoing annual maintenance budget equal to 10% of the gift's value. It had to provide a site. It had to work with Carnegie's secretary, James Bertram, who maintained a famously demanding correspondence and frequently rejected applications he found insufficiently prepared. The process was rigorous. The towns that succeeded in obtaining grants were not passive recipients. They organized committees. They wrote letters. They coordinated with architects. They passed municipal resolutions. In towns where literacy was still partial, where many adults had come through neither formal schooling nor sustained reading culture, this level of organized civic effort raises a question that feels small until you examine it directly. Who was doing this organizing and what were they drawing on? Local elites existed in every town. Lawyers, merchants, physicians, people with education and access to correspondence networks. They could drive an application. That is the standard explanation, and it is reasonable as far as it goes. But the explanation begins to strain when you map it against the physical results. A lawyer organizing a library application does not explain a building with hand-carved limestone detail above the entrance. A merchant's committee does not account for interior ironwork railings with consistent decorative motifs. The organizational explanation covers the paperwork. It does not fully account for the material outcome. Zoom out further. Carnegie's program, for all its scale, was not the only mechanism producing this pattern. In the same decades, state library commissions in New York, Wisconsin, and Minnesota were pushing library development into rural communities through different funding channels. The results, architecturally and structurally, showed similar characteristics. Buildings whose permanence and elaboration outpaced the immediate population's capacity to fill them. A library built for 800 people, designed with reading rooms that could seat 120, shelving capacity for 15,000 volumes, and a children's section, in 1906, in a town that had no bookstore and a single one-room schoolhouse. The building was built for a future that had not yet arrived. Some historians describe this as visionary civic planning, investment ahead of need, infrastructure as aspiration. That reading is available. It is coherent. It fits within a familiar narrative of American optimism and forward thinking. But it sits alongside another observation that is harder to resolve. The consistency of this pattern, across geography, across funding sources, across architectural firms, suggests something more systematic than individual acts of civic optimism town by town. Systematic patterns have explanations. Sometimes those explanations are straightforward. Sometimes the available records don't fully supply them. And sometimes the building is simply standing there, stone and column and arch, in a town of 900 people, waiting for a question that hasn't been asked yet. The American Midwest is a useful place to begin because the records are relatively well preserved and the pattern is visually stark. But the moment you lift the geographic frame and start looking at Britain in the same period, and then at Canada, and then at parts of continental Europe, the pattern does not dissolve. It intensifies. Britain's public library movement has a formal origin point, the Public Libraries Act of 1850. Before that act, publicly funded lending libraries essentially did not exist in England and Wales. After it, local municipalities gained the legal authority to levy a small rate, a local tax, to fund library construction and operation. The act passed with significant opposition. Many argued the public had no demonstrated need for such institutions. Others questioned whether working-class communities would actually use them. What followed over the next 40 years sits uncomfortably against both of those objections. By 1890, hundreds of British towns had constructed public library buildings. And here the scale question returns with a particular sharpness, because Britain in the 1850s through 1880s was simultaneously running one of the most well-documented literacy crises in the industrial world. Parliamentary reports from the 1840s and 1850s described large urban working-class populations. In Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and their surrounding towns, where adult male literacy was estimated at under 50% and female literacy significantly lower. The Revised Code of 1862 was introduced specifically because elementary education was still reaching only a fraction of the children who needed it. The libraries in many cases arrived before the readers. Not arrived modestly. Arrived with reading rooms lined in mahogany. With cast iron spiral staircases. With gas lighting fitted for evening use. Evening use implying, by design, that the working population would come after their shift. The architects of these buildings were not designing for a theoretical future population. The interiors were fitted, furnished, and opened. Catalogs were printed. Staff were hired. In Birkenhead, the first publicly funded library in England opened in 1852, 2 years after the Act, in a building whose interior appointment and structural quality would not have looked out of place in a London institution serving a population 10 times larger. Birkenhead at the time was a rapidly growing but still modest shipbuilding town on the Mersey. Its working population was largely Irish immigrant labor and local dock workers. The literacy infrastructure of the surrounding community was, by any contemporary measure, in early development. The building did not wait. Rochdale, Salford, Warrington, each built public libraries in the 1850s and 1860s whose physical scale and interior quality were consistent with institutions designed for deep, sustained, daily use. Each was located in communities where the majority of potential users were still navigating basic reading acquisition, or had not yet begun. The standard explanation for Britain is similar to the American one. Civic vision, municipal pride, the influence of local reformers and industrialists who genuinely believed that access to books would elevate the working population. The library, on this reading, was aspirational infrastructure, built not for who the community was, but for who it was intended to become. This explanation has real intellectual weight. The Victorian reform movement was genuine. The individuals behind these initiatives were, in most documented cases, sincerely motivated. There is no reason to doubt the intention. But intention does not resolve a structural question that the explanation tends to skip past: the capacity to build. Constructing a public building to the standard of a mid-Victorian civic library, stone or brick facade, formal entrance sequence, load-bearing interior shelving alcoves, fitted gas or later electric lighting, ventilation systems designed for occupancy, required a supply chain. It required skilled labor, stonemasons, carpenters, metalworkers, glaziers. It required architectural drafting and project oversight. In towns of 8,000 or 12,000 people in the 1850s, where did this capacity sit? The answer the record provides is partial. Regional builders, architects based in nearby cities, materials transported by the newly expanded rail network. These answers are real. They account for the logistics in a general sense. They do not fully account for the coordination density, the administrative, financial, and technical convergence required to produce dozens of these buildings simultaneously across a country that was, by its own official records, still resolving basic questions of who could read and who could not. Move to Canada and the timeline sharpens further. Ontario's public library system was formally established through provincial legislation in 1882. Within 20 years, small Ontario towns, Goderich, Strathroy, Ingersoll, Seaforth, had Carnegie-funded libraries whose structural and aesthetic quality matched what was being built in towns 3 and 4 times their size in the United States. Ingersoll, Ontario in 1904. Population approximately 4,500. Its Carnegie Library, completed that year, featured a full basement reading room, main floor open stacks, a separate periodicals alcove, and an exterior elevation in classical revival style with a formal portico. The building's square footage per capita was, relative to the town's population, among the highest of any Carnegie Library on record. The circulation records from Ingersoll's first year of operation, which do survive, show healthy but not extraordinary use. Approximately 400 registered borrowers in year 1. In a town of 4,500, that is roughly 9% of the population actively using the library within 12 months of opening. Which raises a quiet question. Was the building sized for 400 borrowers or for something else? The consistency across these geographies, American Midwest, Industrial Britain, Rural Ontario, is the detail that makes the standard explanation feel like it is doing a great deal of work without quite closing the argument. Each instance can be accounted for individually. Civic ambition here. A generous donor there. A progressive municipal council somewhere else. The individual explanations are available and they are not implausible. But a pattern that repeats across national borders, across funding mechanisms, across architectural traditions, across decades, that pattern starts to ask for a systemic explanation rather than a collection of local ones. Infrastructure before demand. Buildings before readers. Scale before population. Not once, not twice. Consistently, repeatedly, across a period of roughly 70 years, in communities that the official record describes as being in the early stages of the very literacy development these buildings were supposedly built to serve. Some researchers who have examined this pattern in aggregate have noted that the distribution, timing, and architectural consistency of these buildings do not map cleanly onto the local development curves of the towns that received them. The buildings, taken individually, fit their contexts adequately. Taken as a system, they seem to belong to a logic that operated at a different scale than any individual town's needs or ambitions could fully explain. There is a label that some online researchers and independent historians have begun to apply to this kind of architectural and infrastructural anomaly, a shorthand for a set of observations that don't resolve neatly into the standard account. That label and what it does and doesn't mean is where this examination leads next. The word Tartaria appears in historical cartography with genuine frequency. On maps produced in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries by European cartographers, including those published by Ortelius, Mercator, and later by French and British geographical societies, the term is applied to vast regions of Central and Northern Asia. It was a geographical designation loosely applied, covering territories that European mapmakers understood imperfectly and described with varying degrees of accuracy. Tartaria on a 1680 map is not a precisely bounded political entity. It is a label for a region, the way Orient or Levant functioned as labels for imprecisely understood parts of the world. This is the documented history of the term. It is not contested by mainstream scholarship. What is more recent, and what exists almost entirely outside academic literature, is a secondary use of the word, a repurposing that began spreading in online research communities roughly a decade ago and has since grown into a significant interpretive framework. In this secondary usage, Tartaria is not a geographical label. It functions instead as a shorthand for a cluster of historical anomalies, buildings that appear overbuilt for their context, infrastructure that precedes the populations it supposedly serves, architectural consistency across unconnected regions, and timelines that seem to compress or invert the standard sequence of development. The libraries discussed throughout this examination sit squarely within the category of anomalies this framework groups together. It is worth being precise about what this means and what it does not mean, because the label carries associations that vary widely depending on where you encounter it. In its most expansive online form, the Tartaria framework makes strong claims that a prior global civilization existed, that it was systematically removed from historical memory, that the buildings we are examining are physical remnants of that civilization, misattributed to later construction dates. These claims are not supported by academic historical research. They are not supported by the archaeological record. They are not supported by the documentary record, including the construction contracts, architectural correspondence, and civic records that do survive for many of the buildings we have examined. That version of the framework is one interpretation. It is the loudest one. It is not the only one. A more restrained version, the one that is harder to dismiss simply because it is quieter, does not make civilizational claims. It makes an observational claim that the standard explanatory model for 19th century civic infrastructure development does not fully account for what was built, where it was built, at what scale, and in what sequence. This version does not propose a hidden civilization. It proposes a gap, a space between the official account and the physical evidence where the explanation is thinner than it should be. That gap is real. It exists in the records. It has been noted, in more careful language, by architectural historians working within conventional academic frameworks. The questions are not invented. Consider how a mainstream architectural historian might describe the Carnegie Library program. The existing scholarly literature on Carnegie philanthropy, and there is substantial literature, tends to focus on Carnegie's motivations, on the application process, on the civic politics of individual towns, and on the cultural meaning of public libraries as democratic institutions. This is legitimate and valuable scholarship. What that literature spends less time on is the aggregate physical question. Why does a program nominally driven by local community demand produce buildings of such consistent elaboration in communities whose demonstrated capacity to use them was, at the time of construction, genuinely limited? Some historians describe this as paternalistic infrastructure, the imposition of a certain vision of civilization onto communities that had not requested that specific vision. The building arrives not because the community asked for a classical revival portico, but because the architectural vocabulary of the period, filtered through Carnegie's secretary Bertram and his standard plans, determined that this is what a library should look like. The community asked for books. The program delivered columns. That explanation is coherent. It moves the question from the community level to the institutional level. It does not resolve the scale anomaly, but it relocates the agency behind it. One interpretation, then: the consistency is the product of centralized institutional vision operating through a decentralized funding mechanism. Carnegie's program and equivalent programs in Britain and Canada imposed a standardized architectural ambition onto diverse communities regardless of local scale or local need. The buildings look overbuilt because they were built to a template, not to a specification derived from local demand. Another interpretation, proposed by researchers approaching the question from outside conventional frameworks: the consistency is not institutional imposition but inheritance, that these buildings drew on design knowledge, material resources, or structural traditions that were already present in the landscape in some form, and that the Carnegie program and similar initiatives were, in part, working with what already existed rather than constructing entirely from new. This second interpretation is the one that intersects with the broader Tartaria discussion online. It is the interpretation that generates the most debate and the most resistance from academic scholarship. The resistance is not unreasonable. The claim is large, and the burden of evidence required to support it is equally large. The evidence offered in online discussions rarely meets that burden. What neither interpretation fully resolves is the most specific version of the question. In a town of 900 people in 1903, with a single schoolhouse and a literacy rate the county records place below half the adult population, what was the library for? The functional answer is, for the future. For the children who would grow up literate. For the community the town intended to become. That answer is available. It has been given in various forms by historians, by Carnegie's own correspondents, by the civic boosters who drove library applications in small towns across North America. It is an answer that works at the level of intention. At the level of the physical object, the stone, the column, the vaulted reading room ceiling. It raises a quieter and more persistent question about the relationship between what a community needs, what it builds, and what it inherits from the logic of a period it did not fully control. The Tartaria label, in its more careful applications, is an attempt to name that discomfort, not to resolve it, not to replace the historical record with an alternative narrative, but to mark the location of a gap, a place in the explanation where the standard account and the physical evidence do not sit entirely flush with one another. Whether that gap reflects institutional overreach, compressed civic ambition, the distortions of philanthropic paternalism, or something that the existing explanatory frameworks have not yet fully articulated, the record as it stands does not close the question. The buildings remain. The timelines remain. And in towns that were, by every official measure, still becoming literate, the reading rooms were already waiting.